I'm Mila Tappan from FAME, and at FAME, on the education side of the house, our goal is just to make sure that you have the information and resources you need to navigate this paying for higher education process, regardless of where your kiddos are going to school. Our agenda today is that we're going to talk just very briefly about the impact of activity in Washington in case it's concerning some of you and you've heard some things. Then we're going to spend the bulk of our time going through the financial aid process, talking about things you can do to get ready, talking a little bit about the FAFSA, what happens afterwards. And then we do want to talk a little bit about return on investment because that is so critically important. And then just some final tips on making higher education more affordable. So briefly, I just want to let you know that we are very aware of what is happening in Washington, D.C. I want everyone just to kind of like try to take a deep breath. I know it's kind of stressful when we know changes could be coming, might be coming. The nightly news has all sorts of information, but I want you to know that currently no programs have officially changed. So programs are required by statute, including the FAFSA, Pell Grants, federal student loans. Those all still exist. At the moment, those all still exist with the Department of Education, specifically under federal student aid. Certainly, there has been a proposal that federal student loans, that portfolio, move over to the Small Business Administration. But that is simply a proposal. And federal law does require that the department manage student loans. And so, what we have to wait and see is how that all plays out. So, for now, nothing has changed. Certainly, there's reduced staff. I'm not going to say that doesn't concern us, but the programs themselves have not changed. Those of you who may be repaying your own loans or have people in your life who are repaying their loans, there are so many moving parts when it comes to, to repayment of federal student loans. And there have been for years lots of things going on. So, what I just want to let you know on that particular front is that, again, we're monitoring all of this, and we will have a webinar probably in May with an expert by the name of Betsy Mayotte, who will go through all the ins and outs of student loans and student loan repayment and what we need you to know and want you to know to make this as easy as possible. So please just pay attention to our website. We'd love to have you bookmark our website and check it out periodically. And we will be sharing more information as things become more concrete. Right now, there's so much that's just up in the air. So just hold tight, but reach out to us with any questions that you have. So let's focus on financial aid today. Let's talk about what financial aid is and what you need to do to access it and how it all comes together when trying to pay for higher education. So when we talk about financial aid, there are two kind of broad categories of financial aid. One is merit-based aid and the other is need-based aid. So merit-based aid is the type of aid that your student might be eligible to receive based on who they are and what they bring to the table. And what I mean by that is the most common type of merit-based aid is aid from the admissions office. So when the student applies for admissions at a particular school, some schools, not all, but some schools, many schools do have merit scholarships that they potentially will award to students based on things like their GPA and their activities in high school. Merit-based aid has nothing to do with the student's financial situation. It is just based on who they are as an individual. So it's really important as you're talking to schools and researching schools to ask the admissions office specifically, do you have merit aid? How does the student apply for merit aid? Usually it's just part of the admissions application process, but those are good questions to ask because for some families, that merit aid is going to be the big difference maker. So that's an individual question that needs to be asked each school. But again, that aid is awarded outside of the financial aid office, though it gets reported to the financial aid office. The other broad category of financial aid is need-based financial aid, and that's what the financial aid office deals with. That's where we spend a lot of our time working with families. Need-based aid is financial aid that is awarded based on the family's financial situation. And so how schools determine what the family's financial situation is by having students complete financial aid applications, one or maybe more. All schools use the FAFSA, the Free Application of Federal Student Aid, to determine eligibility for federal financial aid. So if you're here today, I want to be sure that you know that that FAFSA needs to be filled out, and it needs to be filled out every year that the student is pursuing higher education. We want everyone to get it done, even if you don't know if you're going to be eligible or what you would be eligible for if you did apply. The only way to know that is to complete the FAFSA. Even things like federal student loans or certain scholarships that are outside scholarships do require that students fill out the FAFSA. So it should just be a given that everyone have that on their to-do list. And we're going to talk more about the FAFSA specifically in a moment. But there are some other things I'd like to focus on before we talk a little bit more about the details of the FAFSA, because I know we have people here who really run the gamut in terms of their students are ready to go on to higher ed, or some of you have more years to prepare for this. So anyone who's still kind of, a little bit from ready to pursue higher education, or your kiddos, we want to be sure that you are doing some of this legwork that we really think will make it a lot easier to pay for higher education when the time comes. One of those first things to be doing is to research colleges, research their costs, research their financial aid. And one thing we want families to focus on is to focus on the net price of a school, not a sticker price. So you may be familiar with the fact that some schools are pushing $80,000, $90,000 per year. Very few people in Maine, especially, pay that much, pay the full amount of cost out of pocket. What you really want to focus on is what is the cost after financial aid. And that's going to be that net price. So we want families to be researching schools because schools are like families. Some schools have a lot of money and some schools don't have as much money. So a great way to get a sense of what a school might be able to offer your student is by using each individual school's net price calculator. So that's going to be found on their website, usually on the financial aid page, but you could just do a search for net price calculator. And what that's going to do is allow you to put in your financial information. The school's going to use their financial information, what they have available to spend, and they're going to give you an estimate of what your student might be eligible to receive. So this is super important to do because, again, what matters is what's that school going to cost to you, not what's the initial cost. And we want to be sure that people are building a list of schools that are affordable. And maybe some are affordable because they have great financial aid that offsets those costs. We also encourage people to think about all types of schools, and some schools are just less expensive from the get-go. So to be doing that research and building that list of schools is so incredibly important. Another way to search for those schools and to get a good sense of which schools have better financial aid is to use the College Board's Big Future website. What happens is schools, when they calculate your financial need, they say, okay, our school costs X number of dollars. Looks like you can contribute this based on your FAFSA. Then you have your need. And schools are going to do their best to fill 100% of that need. The reality is not all schools can fill 100% of need. But the good news is you can find out which schools do a better job at that than others. So if you go to the College Board website, the Big Future website, and search for colleges, you are going to see that you can search for schools based on a whole variety of criteria. Majors, of course, are important. Location is important, but so is affordability. So one of the things this search allows you to do is to say, hey, I really want to focus on affordability. There are over 4,000 schools in this database. And depending on what criteria is most important to you, you're going to be able to take those 4,000 schools and narrow them down to the ones that meet your criteria. So pick whatever criteria is important, but I'd love to have you add affordability in as one of those pieces of criteria. So for example, one of the things you can do is say, maybe I want to search for schools that offer this particular major, and I want to start by finding all of those schools that meet 100% of the need that I'm going to have at that school. I'm going to be honest, not a lot of schools meet 100% need. When I was working with my kiddos, one of the things I said is let's start by looking at schools that meet at least 90% of need. So again, these are schools that just tend to have more financial aid dollars and are going to be able to do a better job of giving you the financial aid resources that you need. Now, all of these things are averages, so it's still really important to apply to schools, to talk to schools, and to know that you are just doing the best that you can to have some great options available to you. Another thing you want to be doing as you're thinking about schools and building that list of schools is to keep track of those schools, specifically keep track of the deadlines that are associated. So we know that students have admissions deadlines. Schools will have a deadline by which the student needs to apply for admission in many cases. But financial aid deadlines are also really critical. So, for a matter of fact, imagine those schools that maybe don't have as much money as they wish that they had. They can't meet 100% of everyone's need. What they do in many cases is they have a priority filing deadline. And what that means is that people who meet that deadline are considered for all of the types of aid that that school has available. People who miss that deadline are still going to be looked at for financial aid, but they're basically going to get what's left. So, to research your schools, to find out what their priority filing deadline is super important. Not all schools have one, but many do. And meeting that deadline is one of the most important ways to maximize your financial aid eligibility. Another thing that you want to be checking on as you're researching these schools and you're visiting their websites is you want to find out what financial aid forms are required. So, as I mentioned earlier, all schools require the FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid. All schools have to use the FAFSA to determine eligibility for federal financial aid and here in Maine for state financial aid. But there are some schools that use a supplemental form simply to award their own institutional aid. And many of those schools that do that use a form called the CSS profile. So the CSS profile does go into more detail, but the schools that require that form have a lot of money typically that they're trying to award, and they want to make sure that their money is going to those who need it most. So as you're looking at your list of schools, as you're making a note of deadlines, make a note of, are they a FAFSA only school or are they a FAFSA school, but I also have to do the CSS profile? Just to kind of give you a sense of how it works here in Maine. In Maine, we have 3 schools that require the CSS profile. You probably can guess which ones they are: Bates, Bowdoin, and Colby. All of the other schools in Maine only require the FAFSA. They use that to determine federal aid, state aid, and institutional aid. But like a Colby, Bates, and Bowdoin are going to use the FAFSA to determine eligibility for federal and state aid, and then the profile to award their institutional aid. Once you get outside of Maine, a lot of schools in the Boston area do require the CSS profile, so be sure that you're checking that out ahead of time so you know which forms need to be completed and when. We do have a tracking worksheet, and it's in our pay publication. I'm going to share a little bit more information about that in a moment, but it's a really great idea to just track this information as you go, whether you use our worksheet. I've seen some pretty cool spreadsheets as well. So keeping track of this will help you feel like you're on top of things and that you don't miss deadlines. We also want to be sure that people are saving as much as possible. In a moment, I'm going to talk about how you can save with confidence and know that saving is not going to undermine financial aid eligibility. So we'll talk more about that, but just in general, save as much as you can. And know that if you haven't, it's never too late to start. There are many, many options available that people can use to pay for higher education and save for higher education. You may be familiar with the fact that here in Maine, we have NextGen, NextGen 529. It's one way to save, and it has some awesome matching grants. But at the end of the day, we just want to be sure that you know that saving is a good thing, and it really will make a difference when it comes to paying for higher education. We also want to be sure that students are researching scholarships, because what might happen in some cases is a student is really set on a particular school, but maybe that school isn't a school that's been able to provide as much financial aid as they wish that they could. But the student really, really wants to go there. Bringing in outside scholarships from organizations, different foundations, is one way to fill that gap that maybe the school is not able to. So we'd love to have you start by visiting famemaine.com/scholarships. On that page, we do have a scholarship search of Maine-based scholarships. Additionally, we have links to other reputable scholarship searches. We also have a spreadsheet that's in Google Docs and Excel that you can use to track scholarships. So if you have a younger student, start looking for those scholarships. You probably won't apply for them until senior year, but doing the legwork to figure out which scholarships to apply for, when they're due, what their website location is, double checking due dates and things like that. As much as can be done ahead of time, like ahead of fall of senior year, the better you're going to be prepared for this part of the process. I do want to highlight one scholarship, which is the Worthington Foundation Scholarship, and we have other fabulous scholarships here in Maine, the Mitchell Scholarship, and many others. But the Worthington Scholarship, I just want to mention, it's a scholarship that's potentially available to students who attend a public high school in Maine, who do plan to attend higher education here in Maine, and they are looking at giving out 1,000 scholarships to those students per year. And these scholarships are renewable and can be used both at the community college and at the four-year schools. So I'd love to have you check that out further, because 1,000 scholarships per year, that's massive and means that so many students out there are going to be eligible for that particular scholarship. And then the last thing I just wanted to share under the Get Ready is, before anyone files a FAFSA, the first step in that FAFSA filing process is to create an account at studentaid.gov. So studentaid.gov is where the FAFSA lives, and everyone needs to have a studentaid.gov account. When you set up a studentaid.gov account, you, like with any website, create a username and password. This username and password, which sometimes is referred to as an FSA ID, a Federal Student Aid ID, is what's used to log into studentaid.gov. It's how you access the FAFSA. It's also how you sign the FAFSA and many other things related to federal student aid. So for example, that username and password are also used to sign master promissory notes if students plan to borrow any federal student loans. So that key first step is for all students to create their studentaid.gov account. That can be done anytime. That's something a student could do today, even if they're not applying for financial aid until next fall or even longer from that. So that can be done anytime. It does need to be done before you file the FAFSA. So that is absolutely critical. We recommend 1 week at least before the FAFSA is filed. We want to be sure that everyone has created their accounts. Okay. So all students need to create an account. And if you are the parent of a student and the student is going to be considered dependent, meaning parent information will be required on the FAFSA, then you as a parent are also going to need to create your own studentaid.gov account. Now, here's the thing about creating a studentaid.gov account. When you create it, you provide your information, like your name and your email address and your birthday and your social security number. So when it comes to studentaid.gov accounts, people can only have one, because we only have one social security number. So we do want to be sure that people keep careful track of their FSA ID or their studentaid.gov information. So we've created a worksheet that has instructions, but also a way to track that information, because sometimes what we see happen is that people forget the information that was used to create the account, and they think, oh, I can just go create a new one. I mean, I've got multiple Apple accounts, right? No, you can only have one. So keeping track of it as you go through the process is the best way to maintain access to the FAFSA and all the other documents that you need. So for you dependent parents out there, for those parents out there that have dependent students, you may already have a studentaid.gov account. If you are repaying your own student loans, or if you have an older child who's gone through this process, you may have already created an account. And if you've already created an account, again, you can only have one. And so you will use that same one for any children who are going through this process in the future. When creating an account, you will need an email address. You have to provide an email address that you have access to, and ideally a mobile phone number as well. This has a lot of two-step verification built into it, so you want to have as many ways as possible of verifying those accounts. We do recommend that when students are setting up their accounts, that they do not use their high school email address, because that's going to go away when they graduate. So we want students, if they haven't already, to create a Gmail account, a Yahoo account, a Hotmail account, so that they will have an account that they will have access to even after they've graduated from high school. Because again, this process of filling out the FAFSA is not a one-time thing. It's going to happen every single year that your student is attending higher education. So when it comes to the FAFSA, so you've done all your things to get ready. When it comes to the FAFSA, you're going to go to studentaid.gov to complete the FAFSA. The FAFSA becomes available every year on October 1st. The last couple of years, it's been delayed a bit, but all indications are that it will be available on October 1st for the upcoming year. It is a roles-based form. So what I mean by that is that when you fill out the FAFSA, there's a student section and a parent section, and they are segmented. So the student will sign into their section with their username and password. The parent will sign into the parent section with their username and password. So sometimes it's comforting to parents to know that the students aren't going to see any of their information. But what happens is whoever starts the FAFSA, either the student can or the parent can, they will invite the other party to complete their section so that the two pieces of the FAFSA, the student section and the parent section, can get connected. And we have many more resources on how this process works, but I just wanted to kind of give you a heads up that it is structured a little bit differently than it used to be. The FAFSA, though, is also way easier to complete than it ever used to be. Now what happens is federal tax information, once you provide consent, comes over automatically into the FAFSA. So there's no more, for the vast majority of people, there's no more pulling out a tax return, entering in all of that information manually. It comes over directly from the IRS. Now, it doesn't show, it lives behind the scenes, but it's there for the schools to use when they are determining what your eligibility is going to be. The FAFSA does have to be filed every single year. So again, not a one-time thing, just when your student is a high school senior, but every single year, and every single year you want to be sure that you meet any priority filing deadlines. Now, a moment ago, I mentioned that the FAFSA is one of these scenarios where savings has very little impact on financial aid eligibility. We want people to save with confidence and know that saving is a really good idea. But sometimes people will say to me, well, how can I trust what you're saying? You know, you say it's a good idea to save, but I have heard that it's not. Well, why saving is so important is because the FAFSA formula is very income driven. That is the driver of eligibility on the parent side, is what is the parent's income. Assets have little, if any, impact on financial aid eligibility. For a matter of fact, families earning less than $60,000, depends on their tax schedules, but most families earning less than $60,000 aren't even going to have to provide any tax information, any asset information. Additionally, any families who have any family member receiving any means-tested benefit won't have to provide any asset information. So say, for example, you have a child in your household that's receiving Maine Care, no assets are going to be required at all. So SNAP, TANF, WIC, any of those programs, no assets. You won't even see the questions. And then even if assets are having to be listed, the FAFSA excludes some really significant assets. It excludes your primary residence, it excludes retirement accounts, and it excludes personal possessions. So the really good news is that even though some people do have assets that do have to be listed on the FAFSA, the most significant assets for most of us are excluded from the FAFSA. So what does have to be listed as an asset on the FAFSA, if assets are required? You would need to list things like cash, savings, checking, second properties, non-retirement investments, and that would include college savings plans, and farm and business debt and net worth if that's applicable to you. Now, I do want you to know that if you do have like a next gen account or a 529, that when you're filling out the FAFSA, maybe you have accounts for multiple kids. The only amount that you will list on that particular FAFSA are 529 plans that list that particular student as the beneficiary. You won't list any of their sibling accounts. Okay. Now, student assets do have a little bit more impact than parent assets, so it's wise to think about how you save. But at the end of the day, I just want you to know that savings is a really good thing, and I want to encourage you to save to the extent that you can. And I know I'm making that sound easier than it is in reality. So what happens is after the FAFSA has been submitted, information will be sent to federal student aid. Once that submit button is hit, once the parent and student sections are complete, the FAFSA will be processed within 1 to 3 days. Students will be notified that their FAFSA has been processed, and they will be able to access something called a FAFSA submission summary that lives at studentaid.gov. Now, one piece of transition that can be really difficult as a parent is that the communications are going to go to the students, not the parents. So that FAFSA submission summary will not be accessible when you log into your account as a parent, okay? Only the student will see this information, and that goes for a lot of things when it comes to admissions and financial aid. Communications are going to be with the student and going to the student. The FAFSA submission summary will list the student aid index, and that is the output of the FAFSA. So the FAFSA information is run through a formula, and that student aid index is the output, and that is going to be listed on that FAFSA submission summary. Once the FAFSA is processed, that information is all sent to all of the schools that your student lists on their FAFSA. So list any school that they're even considering. Students can put up to 20 schools on their FAFSA. So do that research, have that good list of schools, and make sure students include all of those schools on the list when they're filling out the school section in the FAFSA. After the FAFSA is submitted and processed, it's really then going to transition to working with the colleges. So each of the individual colleges that your student has applied to is who you will be working with from that point forward. Okay, so, a federal student aid does not send out financial aid offers. Individual schools send out financial aid offers. I wanted to mention that we do have some resources because we don't have, a huge amount of time today. We could spend hours talking about this, but I do want to let you know that more information is available in our pay publication, and I will send a link to this that you will get in the email follow-up. It's available electronically, or you can order a paper copy. Goes into great detail about these processes, as well as our Get Ready worksheet and information on parent information. Who's required? What happens when parents are divorced? More details are included in all of these resources. And again, those will be included in the email follow-up. So schools get your FAFSA data, and every school does basically the same thing to start. Every school says, how much does it cost to attend this particular institution? And that's going to vary, maybe $15,000 at a community college all in, and maybe $80,000 or $90,000 at some private schools. So they're going to have their individual cost of attendance that takes into account both direct expenses, tuition and fees, and indirect expenses like books and supplies. They're going to subtract out your student aid index. So a moment ago, I mentioned after you file the FAFSA gets processed. On that FAFSA submission summary, the student's SAI or student aid index will be listed. Each school will get the same information. So your SAI will initially be the same at every school. So schools will take the cost of attendance, they'll subtract out your SAI, and that's how much need your student has at that particular school. Because schools cost a different amount, the amount of need at individual schools is going to vary. Schools will do their best to fill as much of that need as they possibly can. And how they are going to fill that is through a variety of types of financial aid that come from a variety of sources. So scholarships and grants are the best of all the types of financial aid. Scholarships are usually merit-based or have a merit component. Grants tend to be strictly based on the family's financial situation. But those scholarships and grants can come from the federal government. You've heard a lot about federal Pell Grants. Those come from the federal government. Here in Maine, we have the Maine State Grant. All students need to do to apply for the Maine State Grant is submit their FAFSA by May 1st of their senior year, and they will be automatically considered for the Maine State Grant. And then institutions have, scholarships and grants in many cases. And then there are private organizations or foundations that also have money available to students. So scholarships and grants, we love those. We want as much of those as possible. Schools will also potentially include work study as a piece of financial aid that's offered on the financial aid offer. Work study is a lump sum of money that students can earn once they're on campus. So work study does not help get the bill paid initially, but is a great way for students to have money to help with those indirect expenses and maybe to save for the next semester or to be their spending money. Different families work it out in different ways, but it's a great opportunity to earn some money while also gaining some great experience while working on campus. And then you're going to find that the vast majority of schools are going to offer a federal direct student loan on their financial aid offer. $5,500 is the maximum amount that a first-year student can borrow. So I would anticipate that virtually all of you, unless there's any changes to anything, will see a federal direct loan that totals $5,500 for first-year students. That might be broken up between some of it being subsidized and unsubsidized. Subsidized is better because it means that there's no interest that's accruing while the student is in school. But otherwise, the federal student loans, subsidized and unsubsidized, are the same. The interest rates are the same. The terms are the same. The only difference is when does interest start accruing. For subsidized, not until the student goes into repayment. And for unsubsidized, it starts immediately. So subsidized is better. And you can choose to borrow just subsidized if your student is offered both. There's never a problem with borrowing less than what's offered if you don't need to borrow everything that is offered. When the time comes, you're going to want to compare financial aid offers. You want to get that apples to apples comparison. We have a worksheet that helps do that. When costs vary dramatically, that makes it sometimes hard to compare. Sometimes students will get an offer of admission and they'll see that a school is going to offer them, X number of dollars in scholarships. It seems like a lot of money. It seems like that school must therefore be very affordable. But what has to be done is to go through and say, okay, here's what the cost is. I like to focus on those direct expenses to start with, tuition fees, housing, food on campus, for example. Subtract out those grants and scholarships. That's going to give you that net cost or that net price. That's what you want to focus on. And I think that if every family out there did that before making a decision about which school their student was going to attend, that would result in fewer surprises when we get to June, July, and the bills come. Because sometimes people are caught a little off guard. So doing that math, and this worksheet will do the math for you, is super important. So this worksheet lives on our website, and so you can access it there. Now, just a few more things, because I just want to check our time. Just a few more things that I want to share before we end today. I know I'm throwing so much information at you, but I want you to know that we can talk more. We have all sorts of ways I'll share at the end for you to get additional information. But we really are focusing a lot on the return on investment. When students pursue higher education and they spend money, and in some cases they borrow to go to school, what is that return on investment? So one way, there's multiple ways to look at that and multiple types of research that you can do. But on a very basic level, what we want people to think about is what's going to happen when the student goes to school, earns that degree, graduates, starts working. What sort of job opportunities are they going to have? What's their potential income going to look like? And how does that connect with how much they have borrowed? So that's one of those things that we think is incredibly important. So I would love to have your students, you and your students together, check out this website, Career One Stop. On this website, it's chock-a-block full of wonderful information, but you can do things like search and see what sort of job openings are looking to be coming in the future for certain majors. You can look at potential earnings, and I really want to focus on that for a moment. I mean, we can't predict what earnings are going to be when your student graduates from college. We don't even know what job they're going to have, but we can get sometimes a ballpark idea of what that is going to look like. So, for example, I did a little research using that website, and I said, hey, if I am going to be a registered nurse and I'm going to be living in Maine, when I graduate, on average, and I went on the lower side of this because first out of college, excuse me, you're not going to be earning the highest salary. So I went and I looked at this, and what this said is basically um, probably around $65,000, give or take. Okay, so that on average is what a registered nurse here in Maine, on again the low end, but on that averages scale, what they look like they might be earning when they graduate. Let's look at a high school teacher. As we know, high school teachers are not paid as much as some of the other professions. And so in this scenario, what we're looking at is their income is probably going to be lower. Using the information that's available, it looks like it will be more around 46, 47,000. Now that's going to depend where in Maine they teach. And here's the cool thing. You can actually put in specific locations. Okay, so you could look at Bangor versus Portland, for example. I just did the Maine average. Okay, so that was around that 46, 47,000. Okay, so you can go and you can do that research. Then the next step is you can use this cool tool on our website. So we have this student loan salary debt calculator. And what this allows families to do is say, how much debt is reasonable for my kiddo based on anticipated earnings when they graduate. And I realize this is all a little squishy, but it does still give a good starting point for having these conversations. So what I've done here is I've said, okay, I just looked up a registered nurse. They're going to earn about 64,600 on average. Um, let's say the interest rates are 6.5. I'm going to repay my loans in 10 years. What this does is it tells you how much you need to earn to comfortably repay that. These are just rules of thumb, but basically it's showing that a student needs to, if they're going to be borrowing, excuse me, if they're going to be earning this amount, that about $38,000 is probably going to be pretty comfortable to repay. Okay, so that's just kind of helps ground the conversation. Now, when we look at our high school teachers, though, they're not going to be earning as much. So they really don't want to be borrowing as much because it's going to be that much more challenging for them to repay their loans. So what looks to be reasonable debt in their case is more like 26 or 27,000. Again, these are just guidelines, rules of thumb, but I think if everyone thought about things from this perspective before students decide on a school or before they borrow any money, that would be a really, really good thing. And people wouldn't be as caught off guard. Another way to do it is to say, if I'm working with a family and they're saying, okay, we need to borrow $20,000 per year, I can say, okay, well, that's $80,000 over the course of a 4-year degree. So I can say, okay, I'm going to put in $80,000 of borrowing in the future. And what this will tell me is how much I need to earn to support that comfortably. And to repay $80,000 comfortably, you really need a salary that's upwards of, again, these are averages, but, much more significant than most people are going to be earning out of college. So connecting these dots and avoiding this disconnect. So if they're really going to be earning more like 50,000, then they really shouldn't be borrowing more than 30. Okay. So just using these tools we hope will be helpful. In closing, I just wanted to mention a few other things, a couple other strategies. As far as paying for higher ed, we're really big fans of the piecemeal approach. When you only have one or two pieces that you're using to pay and finance higher education, those pieces have to be pretty large. I always do my pie equivalent. Have my pumpkin pie at Thanksgiving. 2 pieces of pumpkin pie, cutting it into two is great. I want nice big pieces of pie, but when paying for higher ed, I want multiple pieces of pie. So merit aid, need-based aid, scholarships from the high school or other searches that your student has pursued, student savings, whether it's summer earnings or money that they've been saving all along. family savings. That could even be from grandparents and aunts and uncles and family members. Using tuition payment plans that allow you to kind of pay a portion of the bill as you go, like 5 payments for the fall semester rather than having to pay a lump sum is a really effective tool for many families. The good news about tuition payment plans is they can pay more than just tuition, but also they are not loans. There's no interest charge. There's just usually a small enrollment fee. Borrowing, obviously federal student loans, but beyond that might be something some families are looking at. But also, we don't want to forget about tax credits and deductions. So, all of these multiple pieces coming together mean that no one piece needs to be as large. So, that's why when I think about savings, it's not that the goal, I mean, it's just not realistic for most families, certainly wasn't for us, to save and pay out of pocket. But if I have that as one piece in combination with these others, it becomes much more manageable. So last but not least, the resource that I will also share in your follow-up email is this resource that we put together to talk about the path to affording higher education. It talks about that piecemeal approach, but it also talks about these things like savings that we've talked about today. Getting your financial household in the way that you want it to be, anticipating that if you're going to have a student starting college, and you want to do a tuition payment plan, what can you do with your budget to try to make that more manageable? Keeping in mind that your food bill will likely drop, so that will help. You want to have a chat with your kiddos. You want to be on the same page. We have questions on the back of this form to talk about, what's expected of the parents, what's expected of the students, how much are parents able to assist? Are parents expecting students to, really go heavy into the scholarship searches? What are the expectations on both sides? Easier to start that conversation early, and then not wait until, spring of senior year when emotions can be high. Building that list of affordable schools and then doing that financial aid offer comparison. And then we have a ton of other resources available. One of the things I want to call out, because I've gone through so much information today, is that if you go to famemaine.com/contact, we do have free appointments available via Zoom that we will meet with you, and our team will meet with you, and we will talk about whatever you want to. Navigating the financial aid process, saving for higher education, figuring out how to pay the rest of the bill, all of that. We'd love to work with you and talk with you about that. Email us at education@famemaine.com.
Okay.
Or call us at our 1-800 number. So if people just have, a question that they want answered, they can do that. Again, they can visit our website. We have lots of information there. They can sign up again to join our mailing list. They can sign up to have a Zoom appointment. But especially if they just have a question or two, call us or email us. That's the best place to get started at those contact points listed on this slide.